Racism, Horror, and the Haunted Home: How the American Dream Became the American Nightmare. In the suburban ideal of the cultural imagination, there are lush lawns and immaculate landscaping, children playing freely while women bake and smile. Husbands stream away for work in the morning and stream back home for dinner in the evening, flush with professional success. Could this be perfection? However, the suburbs entice not only for what they offer, but also for what and whom they exclude. Dolores Hayden, in her book Redesigning the American Dream, writes that American cities and housing were designed to satisfy a nation of predominantly white, young, nuclear families, with father as breadwinner, mother as housewife, and children reared to emulate these same limited roles. While the gender divisions are troubling, also troubling is the emphasis on the category white. Through a variety of legal discriminatory techniques, the suburbs were preserved for white, young, nuclear families. For example, the Homeowners Loan Corporation defined certain neighborhoods as minority neighborhoods and made it an official policy to refuse to lend to residents of those neighborhoods, deeming it too risky. The Federal Housing Administration also refused to insure mortgages in or near Black neighborhoods and only subsidized builders who committed to selling their new homes exclusively to white people. By the time the last home in Levittown, New York was built in 1951, the development was still 100% white. In the years since, little has changed. Data from the US Census in 2017 indicates that Levittown, New York was 75% white, 1% Black, and 15% Hispanic, while Levittown, Pennsylvania was 88% white, 4% Black, and 6% Hispanic. In 2018, the home ownership gap between whites and African Americans was wider than it was during the Jim Crow era. While whiteness dominates in suburban neighborhoods off screen, it also dominates in suburban neighborhoods on screen. An overwhelming majority of haunted home narratives revolve around white protagonists, so overwhelming, in fact, that I only found two examples of Black homes being haunted, and one of these examples is satire. Aviva Brivel and Sian Nagai, in their article on the horror film Candyman, argue that being frightened is paradoxically a sign of empowerment, as if the privilege of being haunted, much like the privilege of owning a home, is one reserved for white Americans. The conspicuous lack of minority representation in haunted home narratives is explicitly dealt with by Eddie Murphy in his stand up comedy special Delirious from 1983. Although Murphy does not address why those whose houses are haunted are always white, he does raise the question of why those white residents stay. Murphy asks, why don't white people just leave the house when there's a ghost in the house? Y'all stay in the house too fucking long. Just get the fuck out of the house. Very simple. There's a ghost in the house, get the fuck out. He specifically mentions Poltergeist, in which the protagonists not only stay in the house, but invite more white people over to help them deal with the situation, and the Amityville Horror, in which a ghost specifically warns the white family to get out, and yet they remain. Murphy retorts, a ghost say get the fuck out? I would just trip the fuck out the door. Fittingly, the title of Jordan Peele's directorial debut, inspired by Eddie Murphy's routine, is Get Out. Peele talked to Entertainment Tonight about Murphy's comedy special, describing how Murphy compares the reaction of a white family to a reaction of a Black family to being in a haunted home and refers to it as, quote, one of the best bits of all time, end quote. In the same interview, Peele also explains that one of his favorite parts of many horror films is the doubt that sinks in when protagonists wonder if they are imagining the strange things that are happening. In Get Out, the doubting protagonist is the photographer Chris Washington, played by Daniel Kaluuya. While the evil in Get Out is not connected to supernatural forces, since there are no demons at play, the core essence of the haunted home narrative, that the home is actually the most dangerous place in the world for the vulnerable, runs throughout the whole film. Also, like the haunted home narrative, Get Out explores the evil that lies just behind beautiful, opulent, and supposedly safe surroundings. Get Out was written during Barack Obama's presidency, and Peele wanted to point out the insidious qualities that white liberals have, as well as the fact that racism is a human problem, even among those who consider themselves above it. The sunken place, where African American targets are exiled, is a metaphor for a state of marginalization. It is the dark hole we throw dark people in, he continues, such as the prison industrial complex. It is a place of powerlessness. The sunken place also refers to the movie theaters where Black people go to watch horror movies, but where they rarely see themselves on screen. We can scream at the screen, but we're not going to get represented on the other side. Not only is Get Out a commentary on the insidious racism thriving throughout American culture, but it is also a direct statement on the whiteness of horror movies. This is precisely why it is so significant that Chris survives in Get Out. In movie after movie, book after book, Black characters are expendable, inevitable losses on the white hero's journey. So it is meaningful not only that Chris survives, unlike, for instance, the Black protagonist at the heart of Night of the Living Dead, but that Chris remains at the heart of the narrative. Chris's character has a privilege normally reserved for white protagonists, an emotional narrative arc. Despite the persistent depiction of horror films as misogynistic, they repeatedly feature the character that Carol Clover describes as the final girl. While women may be abused and terrorized throughout horror narratives, it is repeatedly the lead female character, the final girl, who takes down her abuser and, significantly, who survives, which complicates our understanding of the misogyny present in so many horror narratives. However, there is no final girl equivalent with regard to the African American experience. African Americans are either absent entirely or sacrificed, literally or metaphorically, along the way. By escaping both the sunken place and the Armitage house, Chris becomes the final girl of sorts, his voice the last one standing. The film A House is Not a Home is one of the rare haunted house narratives to include an African American family defending themselves and their home without being a satire. Ben and Linda Williams buy a new house hoping that a change of scenery will improve their struggling marriage. That classic idea that a new home will fix all things. Unfortunately for them and their marriage, the house is haunted. Gerald Webb, who in addition to playing the male protagonist, was also a producer of A House is Not a Home, says that the people involved with the film knew exactly what they were doing in filling a void. He knew they were breaking new ground for diversity in horror films, and that they specifically wanted to do so without making the film a comedy or insulting stereotypical African Americans. Webb goes on to point out how shameful it is that there have historically been very few African American based horror, occult, and haunted house films produced and distributed. One of the primary goals of the project was to service the African American market, allowing Black people finally to see people who looked like them in the types of horror films they've long supported. Unfortunately, the film did not start a trend. At first glance, The Haunted Mansion is a comedic take on the haunted home narrative, complete with all the familiar twists, but in a kid-friendly format, as a haunted house movie based on a Disney theme park attraction should be. However, a closer look reveals a deeply troubling film that, even though it features an African American family in a haunted home, serves more to reinforce the white status quo of both American suburbs and horror films. One of the first signs that there is something different about this movie is that the Evers family does not own the haunted house within which the film takes place. Rather, Jim and Sarah are real estate agents who initially come to see the house believing that the owner wants to sell it. In effect, they are in the home as potential employees of the owner. While that is already a significant diversion from the norm, it turns out that that story was just a ruse to bring Sarah to the house. Why was Sarah brought to the house? Because the house's original owner, Master Gracie, wants to marry her. Sarah's own particular preference, to stay married to her actual husband, is irrelevant, and the last act of the movie is devoted to Master Gracie and his butler Ramsay fighting with Jim over the ownership of Sarah, as if she were a particularly nice piece of furniture. Another sign that this is not an ordinary haunted house tale is that the Evers family members are not the central characters. Rather, they are supporting characters to those who live in the actual mansion. Gracie, Ramsley, and the servants, as well as Madame Leota, whose head offers wisdom from within a crystal ball. The Evers family is there to liberate those characters, as well as the hundreds of others in the cemetery out back. Yet another twist is that once they have succeeded in helping those characters, they are gifted the home. So, unlike every other haunted home narrative, the family gets the home at the end of the film rather than as the inciting incident. And significantly, the house is given to them rather than their having the agency and clout to buy it themselves. This is a running gag, in fact. Jim Evers, ambitious real estate agent, is hopelessly uncouth and out of place within the mansion. For instance, when Jim asks Ramsley about important qualifications for the position of butler, just in case Jim needs to hire one someday, Ramsley replies, attention to detail, understanding priorities, and after a pause, knowing one's place. The implication is that Evers does not know his place, a cruel comment often directed at Black Americans. Later, Ramsley even describes Evers as an insufferable fool. Until African American horror movies become more commonplace, satire remains one of the few opportunities to call attention not only to the lack of racial representation, but also to the insidious habit of viewing whiteness as neutral, as a default. As Richard Dyer argues, white power secures its dominance by seeming not to be anything in particular. One of the most useful attributes of comedic takes on horror tropes is precisely their ability to question that which we consider to be the norm. Not only questioning the prevalence of whiteness, but also questioning common behaviors and patterns within these narratives. Another benefit, of course, is the appearance, however fleeting, of racial diversity on screen. While Scary Movie primarily skewers the films Scream and Scream 2, Scary Movie 2 specifically parodies the tropes of haunted house narratives, making direct reference to films such as The Legend of Hell House, The Amityville Horror, The Changeling, Poltergeist, and The Haunting. The premise of Scary Movie 2 is straightforward and familiar. Professor Oldman and his assistant want to study potential paranormal activity at a supposedly haunted mansion. Suffice to say, the house is haunted, And despite the hijinks and the cliched plot points, the film is most useful as a commentary on the whiteness of haunted home narratives and the absurdity of the horror genre's most common tropes. Scary Movie 2, for instance, verbalizes that otherwise unspoken question: why do white people act the way they do in these movies? For instance, Brenda asks, how come every time some scary shit happens, you white people say, let's split up? Despite the fact that she insists that the group should stick together, the characters split up anyway, rendering them more vulnerable to attack. At another point, Cindy runs screaming from a skeleton, to which Brenda, bemused, says, it's just a skeleton. Similarly, in A Haunted House, Keisha moves into her boyfriend Malcolm's place. In a reference to found footage horror films, such as Paranormal Activity, Malcolm sets up video cameras in the house to prove to Keisha that the house is not haunted. As soon as Malcolm figures out that the house is indeed haunted, his first instinct is to leave. This is for white people. This ain't what black people do. We don't investigate. We run. We run. We live. The film repeatedly distinguishes between how white people and black people react to evil spirits. Marlon Wayans argues that the film is not a typical parody. Rather, it attempts to show how a black couple would react to a situation we have seen time and time again with white protagonists. While the lack of racial diversity in haunted home narratives might make it strange to have a paper devoted to race in this context, it is precisely because of that lack that this topic is important. It is by calling attention to that lack that we can reach a deeper understanding of the nefarious impact of so many years of government condoned and subsidized discriminatory practices. And it is specifically within the context of haunted homes that we do so here. Aviva Brivel and Sian Nagai argue that the true anxiety expressed in these films has to do with spaces resistant to change, namely white middle-class environments. They point out that while the fear-provoking figures vary in appearance from film to film, the protagonists resemble one another with their white middle-class heteronormativity, perhaps consciously or subconsciously responding to fears of a diversifying suburbia. Jonathan Allen, in an analysis for NBC News, explains comments made by Donald Trump in a press conference in July 2020. Trump claimed that Joe Biden wants to abolish the suburbs. Allen then quotes Democratic strategist Michael Starr Hopkins, who argues that Trump's message is clear. Elect me, and I'll keep Black people out of your neighborhoods and out of your schools. This adherence to a white status quo further reinforces the supposed exclusivity of American suburbs. Racism in the United States has long been loud and public. But racism in the United States has also been quiet and insidious, lurking behind government policy, corporate bureaucracy, and Hollywood's casting choices. While haunted home narratives are not generally considered to be political statements, perhaps they speak loudly for what is absent, demonstrating the persistent whiteness of American suburbs and American horror films, schemes that were decades in the making. Thank you.